Hello, today we're going to have a blind Tolstoy taste test so you can find out which translation of Anna Karenina is right for you. So the translation of Anna Karenina that I'm using in the Hardcore Literature Book Club is the Pevere and Volokonsky translation, which is a translator team, husband and wife, and they shot to fame when Oprah featured them on her book club around, I believe it's 1998. Up until that time, the predominant translations of Anna Karenina were by a lady called Constance Garnett and another translator couple team called Alma and Louise Maud. Garnett's translation was in 1901 and she got the go-ahead from Tolstoy herself, and the Maud translation was around 1922, I believe, and they also got the go-ahead, though those two were not writers. They actually ran a small carpet cleaning service or something like that. And then very recently, a new translation has shot to fame, and that's by Rosamund Bartlett. And Bartlett has one of the most beautiful covers of Anna Karenina. If you just want a beautiful book to display or to take down and enjoy dipping into, the Oxford Anna Karenina, translated by Rosamund Bartlett, is very, very good. I first learned about Bartlett and what she knows about Russian literature, including Chekhov, Tolstoy, from her biography of Tolstoy. She's got a really good biography. And the number one question that I get, basically all the time, I basically get this question every single day, is which is better, the Rosamund Bartlett translation or the Pevere and Volokonsky translation? Most people have whittled it down to those two. Constance Garnett, as many people might know, just sounds like Constance Garnett. She doesn't translate the idiosyncrasies or the sense and the feeling of whatever writer she's translating. Dostoevsky does not sound like Dostoevsky. Tolstoy does not sound like Tolstoy. Chekhov doesn't sound like Chekhov. And the same for Turgenev. They just sound like Constance Garnett. Whereas Pevere and Volokonsky, they actually try and attempt to translate the feeling of what Tolstoy is like, the reading experience, and render it into English. And a lot of people, including a lot of Russians, bilingual Russians, think that they have been successful. The translation I absolutely wouldn't bother with, personally, though some people do like it, is the Maud translation. I think they do not get the sense, and it is not an easy read. Which brings us on to the Rosamund Bartlett translation. And the thing is, when I first fell in love with Anna Karenina, it was through the Pevere and Volokonsky translation. But then I came to the Rosamund Bartlett, and it is a beautiful translation. It's quite different from the Pevere and Volokonsky, and Bartlett outlines the different philosophies and theories of translation that she was working towards in translating. But what I would describe with Bartlett is reading Anna Karenina in her translation is kind of like picking up an English novel, like a Jane Austen novel. So it really is the experience of reading Anna Karenina as though it were an English work. Whereas when you read Pevere and Volokonsky, though it's very, very masterful, and apparently they do a really good job translating the nuance and the feel and the texture of Tolstoy's original, it does feel like it's in translation. It's not as smooth. The visuals aren't as vivid and bright, and some of their choice of lexis can be a bit abstract, a bit poetic, which I love. But if you want an easier read, something that's more smooth and quite musical, Bartlett's translation is masterful. And she also has a ton of notes and annotations. She has a great introduction, and you really come away from her translation knowing a lot about Tolstoy and the work and Russia. I didn't realize until I read her translation that Tolstoy was a beekeeper, and he translated a lot of specific agricultural language that is untranslatable. He used that in the original Russian. So things like this, things like giving the peasants, the muziks, their own sort of rural dialect, pose a problem for the translator. So is the fact that Russian is a declension-filled language and English is not. So is the fact that with English, you have 100 words for one thing, to mean one thing. Whereas in Russian, you have one word that can have 100 meanings. So that's really hard because you've got one word in a context, but it could mean many different things depending on the context. And there's a lot of irony, there's a lot of double meanings there that are untranslatable. You've also got the fact that Tolstoy's original language is stuffed with relative clauses and has a lot of adjuncts and compounds and gerunds, and he crams lots of words together. Tolstoy, and I believe this is Chekhov who said this, is like a bird that doesn't care about the beauty of his plumage. He just cares on building a very well-oiled machine, so it's quite magnificent. His original is very, very simple and very, very direct, but now and then you'll get these very, very long pages and sentences that go on and on and on, and are quite complex, but you can't help but marvel at them. This is also a challenge for the translator. So it's like, do you translate Tolstoy exactly? Do you try to be literal and render, or do you try and put yourself in an English Tolstoy, in an alternate universe if Tolstoy had been born English? That is a challenge. So there are a lot of different philosophies and theories about translation. There's the sense versus style versus feeling translation. There's how to be faithful to the writer. Ultimately, I think two things which sound contradictory, but I think a translation can make or break your reading experience. If you're reading a piece of world literature and you're reading in translation and you don't like it, it might be the translation ruining it for you. So the translation can be make or break, and here's where the contradiction comes in. With these great books, very often there's not a huge amount of difference. It's kind of difference in the margins, unless you pick a really bad translation. Ultimately, the characters and the themes and preoccupations of the novel transcend language and boundaries and borders. So you can still appreciate the characters, you can still get into the story. So a lot of people procrastinate getting into these big books by deliberating over what the best translation is. It's best to just get stuck in and find out for yourself. But what we're going to do with the Tolstoy taste test, I'm going to read one of my favourite passages, just a bit of it, from Anna Karenina. This is part 2, chapter 12. I'm going to read you 4 different translations. We're going to read the Pavir and Volokhonsky, the Maud translation, we're going to read Bartlett, and we're also going to read Constance Garnett. But I'm not going to tell you which is which, so what I'd like you to do is to don your blindfold, get a piece of paper and a pen, and then just write number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and literally just try and give it a rating, maybe out of 10 or a 5-star rating, or like a yes or no, thumbs up, however you want to rank it, for how you respond to it. Does it give you pleasure? Do you enjoy it? Can you see the visuals? Does it affect you? Does it move you? Does it sound nice? Does the spirit sweep you up? Whatever criteria you want to use, and just figure out, do you like it? Because ultimately, that's what's important, figuring out which one you like. And then you'll have the answer, and I'll reveal to you which one you like, and you'll have the key to which translation you would like to read for Anna Karenina. Let's get into it. Okay, translation number 1. In the morning, the bright sun rose and quickly ate up the thin ice covering the water, and the warm air was all a-tremble, filled with the vapours of the reviving earth. The old grass and the sprouting needles of new grass greened, the buds on the guelder rose, the currants and the sticky, spiritus birches swelled, and on the willow, all sprinkled with golden catkins, the flitting, newly hatched bee buzzed. Invisible larks poured trills over the velvety green fields and the ice-covered stubble. The peewit wept over the hollows and marshes, still filled with brown water. High up the cranes and geese flew with their spring honking. Cattle, patchy, malted in all but a few places, lowed in the meadows. Bow-legged lambs played around their bleating, shedding mothers. Fleet-footed children ran over the drying paths, covered with the prints of bare feet. The merry voices of women, with their linen, chattered by the pond, and from the yards came the knock of the peasants' axes, repairing ploughs and harrows. The real spring had come. Okay, so mark down what you thought of that. If you liked it, how much you liked it. You might get sick of this passage, although I love this passage so much that I don't think you can get sick of it. Let's go on to the second one, and then you're going to mark down your impression, okay? In the morning, the bright rising sun quickly melted the thin ice on the water, and the warm air all around vibrated with the vapour given off by the awakening earth. Last year's grass grew green again, and new blades came up like needle points. Buds swelled on the guelder rose and currant bushes, and on the sticky, spicy birch trees, and among the golden catkins and on the willow branches the bees began to hum. The unseen larks burst into song above the velvety fresh green and the frozen stubble. The peewits began to cry above the water brought down by the storm and still flooding the low-lying places and marshes, and high up the cranes and geese flew, uttering their spring call. The cattle, who had lost all but a few patches of their winter coats, began to low in the meadows. The crooked-legged lambs began to play round their bleating mothers, who were losing their wool. Swift-footed children began to run along the quickly drying paths, marked with imprints of bare feet. The merry voices of women who were bleaching their linen began to chatter by the ponds, and the axes of peasants, getting ready their wooden ploughs and harrows, clicked in the yards. The real spring had come. Alright, that's the second translation. Mark down what you thought of that. Blindfold still on. Let's go on to the next translation. In the morning, the sun rose brilliant and quickly wore away the thin layer of ice that covered the water, and all the warm air was quivering with the steam that rose up from the quickened earth. The old grass looked greener, and the young grass thrust up its tiny blades. The buds of the guelder rose and of the currant and the sticky birch buds were swollen with sap, and an exploring bee was humming about the golden blossoms that studded the willow. Larks trilled unseen above the velvety green fields and the ice-covered stubble-land. Peewits wailed over the low lands and marshes flooded by the pools. Cranes and wild geese flew high across the sky, uttering their spring calls. The cattle, bald in patches where the new hair had not grown yet, lowed in the pastures. The bow-legged lambs frisked round their bleating mothers. Nimble children ran about the drying paths, covered with the prints of bare feet. There was a merry chatter of peasant women over their linen at the pond, and the ring of axes in the yard, where the peasants were repairing ploughs and harrows. The real spring had come. All right, mark down what you thought about that. Okay, let's go on to our last translation. The following morning, a bright sun rose and quickly devoured the thin layer of ice coating the waters, and everywhere the warm air shimmered as it was suffused with the steam rising from the worn earth. The old grass and the emerging needles of young grass turned green, buds swelled on the guelder rose, and on currant bushes, and birch trees sticky with sap, and bees on the first spring flight from their new home started buzzing about the gold-flecked willows. Invisible larks burst into song above the velvety green shoots and the ice-covered stubble. Peewits sent up plaintive calls over wetlands and marshes still sodden with murky, stagnant water. And up on high, cranes and geese flew past with their spring cackle. The cattle, still showing patches of their winter coats, started lowing in the pastures. Lambs started frisking on their crooked legs round their bleating mothers, who were shedding their fleeces. Fleet-footed children started running along paths that were beginning to dry, leaving behind prints of their bare feet. Women washing linen at the pond started chattering merrily, and axes started falling in the yards, where peasants were repairing their ploughs and harrows. Real spring had arrived. Okay, so let's reveal which was which, and then you let me know which one you preferred. The first one was Pevere and Volokonsky. That's the one we're working from in the book club. The second one was by Alma and Louise Maud. The third one was by Constance Garnett. And the fourth one, the one you just listened to, was by Rosamund Bartlett in this beautiful copy. So it's up to you. There's no silly answers, there's no wrong answers. It is just a matter of preference and aesthetic taste. They're all different, they all have their merits, and they all have their drawbacks. Let me know which one spoke to you, which one sort of captured you and enraptured you the most, and perhaps even let me know why. And if you want any of those translations, for ease, I'm going to drop some links directly to them below. Hope you enjoyed this Tolstoy taste test, and maybe we'll go even deeper and put them up against each other and pick them apart and see where those differences are, and maybe ask why the differences are there. Thank you very much for watching, and happy reading.